William Campbell Underhill was a 20-year-old from Minneapolis, Minnesota. He was an avid fisherman and overcame polio as a child. On March 2nd, 1969, he went to a house party attended by many of his high school friends. At some point, he left, departing well before the festivities ended. He was never seen again. I'm Ed Densel, and this is Unfound. First test flight of the Concorde. Soviet and Chinese armies clashed in an outpost on the Ussuri River. I have no idea where that is. You can look it up. Sirhan admitted he assassinated Bobby Kennedy. Apollo 9 launched to test the lunar module that would eventually be used on Apollo 11. The United States Navy started the Navy Fighter Weapons School, something we now know as Top Gun at Naval Air Station Miramar in California. Jim Morrison, lead singer of The Doors, was arrested for indecent exposure, right here in Florida. The birth of Academy Award winner and James Bond villain Javier Bardem. In addition, the birth of daughter, now son, of Sonny and Cher, Chaz Bono. That's the way it was, the first week of March 1969. For some of you, I'm sure it seems like yesterday. For others, like myself, we weren't quite alive yet. For Bill Underhill and many other people his age, early March 1969 was a time of worry and speculation. At the party that Sunday, there was talk of Vietnam. Would the young men get drafted? Or if they did, would they go? Or would they flee to Canada like so many did? Some even spoke of suicide. If they didn't get drafted, how would they continue with their education and jobs, knowing so many of their friends were dying in Southeast Asia? Yes, the future for many of them was unknown. Then, adding to that mystery of where the world was heading and what they'd do in it, was the disappearance of their friend Bill Underhill. He took part in all the deep conversations about Vietnam and other issues at the Minneapolis party that night. Then he disappeared. And now a summary of the case. This is brought to you by my friend Megan Good's site, charlieproject.org. At the time of Bill's disappearance, he was living at home with his parents and commuting to the University of Minnesota. He was a good student, and in fact had been studying with his younger sister Sarah right before he went to the party from which he disappeared. Although the Underhills were a tight-knit family, Bill and his father did occasionally have blow-ups, exacerbated by the fact that they lived under the same roof. The party held the night Bill disappeared was in an area called Dinkytown. Although Bill was in college, most of the people at this gathering were people he knew from high school. In fact, an ex-girlfriend was even there. She spoke to him that night. At some point, well before anyone else left, Bill departed the house. Partygoers do not remember him being drunk or otherwise incapacitated. Within a few moments, a friend of his also left the residence to see where Bill went. The friend couldn't find him. Bill was never seen again. The police did an investigation starting a few days later, but they found no signs of the missing 20-year-old. In addition, neither they nor Bill's family had any theory as to what could have happened to him. It wasn't until over a decade later that Bill's family began to find out private information about him. That he'd been fingerprinted by the FBI in 1968. That he'd possibly taken part in a 1960s version of Fight Club. These new revelations continue to this day, with one recently giving them a new clue as to what happened to him after he left the party that night. The interview for this episode is with Bill's sister, Mary Underhill. Unfound News. I'm still working on Volume 2. I hope to get it out before Christmas, but a lot of things got in the way. No worries, though. It's coming, and it will be just as good as Volume 1. Speaking of which, check out the paperback and ebook versions of Volume 1 at Amazon.com. Next, I've started to go through Western Pennsylvania disappearance cases that might get selected for the work I'll be doing with TribLive.com in Pittsburgh. We have a lot of choices, unfortunately, over 80 of them. We've had a couple meetings so far, and I'm excited to see the great work we're going to do. Finally, I need to thank a recent Patreon contributor, Carol. I haven't been talking about Patreon much recently because there's so much to go through in this news section these days, but I hope you will consider contributing to Unfound. There are some nice perks that go along with it. Access to the blog, free ebooks and paperbacks, getting mentioned on the program. So please check it out and consider supporting Unfound. Thanks. Where you can find Unfound. Unfound is on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, iTunes, Podomatic, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, Podbean, and Overcast. Unfound is also on Spotify now. The email address, unfoundpodcast@gmail.com. The website, unfoundpodcast.com. Please check out the Secret Stephen Kocher episode. And now, if you click on the merchandise button, it will show the links to both the books on Amazon and the playing cards at makeplayingcards.com. Please visit the page at your convenience. The website at Trib Total Media, triblive.com/news/unfound. They've done a really nice job building that page. Unfound also has a PayPal account. Please contact me privately if you'd like to contribute that way. And please mention Unfound on all true crime Facebook pages and other websites and forums. Thank you. A note. As Unfound usually does, my guest and I give you the facts in this interview. Their presentation should not mean that Mario or anyone else in our family is pointing the finger at anybody. You, the listeners, will ultimately make your own decisions. But at this time in December 2017, no one close to Bill, family or friends, has ever been suspected or implicated in his disappearance. I'm happy to have on this episode of Unfound the sister of Bill Underhill, Mary Underhill. Mary, welcome to Unfound.
Thank you.
Tell the listeners a little bit about Bill. He was your older brother, wasn't he?
He's my older brother. I have an older brother and sister. Bill was the oldest. He was 7 years older than I am. And my sister was just 15 months younger than Bill. And she's 16 years old, or 6 years older than I am.
And would you say that all three of you were fairly close? Did the age difference between you and Bill have an effect, or did you bond a lot? How would you say your relationship was?
Well, I think we were all close, but my sister and Bill were certainly closer because they were closer in age. And my interests as, being 6-7 years younger were different than theirs. But we were all close, but I think they probably had definitely the closest relationship.
And what kind of family were the Underhills? What was your family? What did you like to do? Vacations? What kind of good times did you like to have back then?
I think one of the sort of biggest things that we did together is that my father taught biology and zoology, and every summer we went to northern Minnesota to Itasca State Park, which had a biological station where students would go for the summer, and we were fortunate enough as a family to live there for the summer. So from Memorial Day to Labor Day, that's where we were. So we spent a lot of time outdoors. Sarah and Bill had probably different adventures than I did, but a lot of time, canoeing, fishing, walking, playing, and they, too, had things that they did together with sort of older kids. There was kind of a younger crowd and an older crowd, and I was part of the younger crowd. So I didn't know all the same people that Bill and Sarah did up there, but sometimes I knew younger children from the same families.
So you went up there for the summer and just made friends with other families who were up there in the area?
Correct, right. Mm-hmm. And other families that had parents that were teaching there.
Right. So you just packed up the car, threw all your luggage in there. Must have been that's quite an experience staying up there for 3 months. You must have had to have taken a lot of clothes and.
It doesn't. Now looking back on it, I'm not sure how my mother and father did it because it seemed like it was pretty compact. But we it was in some ways, a pretty simple way to spend the summer. And we went to town once a week and went shopping, and that was about it. Otherwise, we were pretty much there, and there was a beach nearby and swimming, and it was pretty wonderful,
Mm-hmm.
especially looking back on it.
And I've seen some of those pictures from the late '60s that are on a website that we're going to talk about eventually. But it seemed like you brought up fishing, but fishing was a major part of your family, and I can relate to that because fishing is a big part of my family as well. It seemed like that was one of the main interests in your family.
It was. My father studied freshwater fishes, and my brother was an avid fisherman. My father was. They did a lot of fly fishing, something I never learned to do, but they did a great deal of.
And Bill, on his own, was he into sports? Did he play any in high school? How did he do in school? While in from what you understand back then, what kind of student and what other interests did he have outside of the family interests?
I think his main interest always was fishing. He did a lot of fishing. He played football a little bit in high school. He was on the wrestling team. He did a lot of weightlifting.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember any other sports that he was involved in.
Do you think that that was, I remember back to I guess my teenage years of growing up in Leechburg, Pennsylvania. I guess it would have been maybe a little difficult to be away from my friends for an entire summer. Was that ever a problem with Bill? Did he ever wish to maybe just stay back there in the area that you grew up to hang out with his friends during the summer?
I
And
think when I was probably about 12, so Bill would have been probably 18 then, he wanted to stay home for the summer. And that was when my father continued to go up to Itasca, but my sister and Bill and I stayed home in the cities
Mhm.
with my mom.
Okay.
And he
And
made some very good friends up there too that came back every year.
and how far was that from where your home was?
It was about, I'm going to guess, about 200 miles north.
It's pretty far. So it's like
Pretty
a
far.
yeah, it's like a possibly a 3 to 4 hour drive.
Right, right. And after he stopped going up, for the whole summer, in talking with some of his friends over the years, unbeknownst to me, that actually he and some of his friends went up and would stay with my dad and stay for a weekend or maybe longer up at
Mhm.
Itasca.
Okay. Now, just a couple days ago, you had sent me an email that your sister Sarah, who is still alive,
Yes.
had some of her recollections. What do you want to tell the listeners about how she remembers Bill in contrast to your memories, which, of course, you were younger, not as close to an age? What did Sarah have to say?
Sarah talked about, they were very close growing up. Um, we have lots of pictures of them when they were little, and um, Bill being a bit older. In a lot of the pictures, it really looks like he's sort of watching out for her. They seem to love each other very much and have a lot of fun. She remembered, of course, the summers and spending time up at Itasca in the summertime, and also that they went up sometimes in the winter with our father and would do research, help him with research on the lake. Um, she also remembered how much he loved music and could remember that he especially liked The House of the Rising Sun and Bob Dylan's greatest hits.
Mhm.
Her
Big
memory,
music from the late '60s,
yes,
1960s.
yes,
Sure,
and
sure.
he had quite a collection of music actually, um, and she remembers him as very kind. She remembers a point when, in their mid-teens, that she was worried for him more, that things started to change in some ways. Maybe he wasn't quite as happy,
Hmm.
but she always felt very close to him. And her last memory of him is studying for finals. They were both students at the University of Minnesota. That they were home on a Sunday night studying for finals, and she didn't have any sense that anything was
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 going to
different that
happen.
particular night.
that Bill was going to disappear. So, would you
Right.
say, except for those people at that party, would you say that she's one of the last people to see him before he disappeared? And he's definitely the last. She was definitely the last family member, right?
Right. Right.
Okay.
My last memory of seeing him was a friend had come over and we were Girl Scouts, and we had our Girl Scouts outfits on, and we're going out to, I don't know if it was to deliver cookies or take orders for cookies when you still go door to door, and she had brought cookies that her mother made, and she gave them to Bill. And my friends certainly liked Bill, and he was always
Mm.
kind to them.
Okay. Now, there are a couple things that we're going to mention about him before we get into the facts of maybe the day before and the day of his disappearance, and these are just things that listeners need to keep in mind. And we're going to talk about them in maybe a little bit more detail later. Um, there was this aspirin incident that Bill had at one time. Maybe we need to talk about that. And what exactly happened with this aspirin incident? Do you remember how old he was and what went on there?
I believe he was still in high school. Um, my recollection of it is quite vague, although I do remember that he was sick, and it was at night, um, and that my father, I believe, took him to the hospital, and he had taken a bottle of aspirin, and I'm guessing he was probably either a junior or a senior in high school. He was in the hospital for a few days. I believe it
Wow.
was around Christmas time. And one
Wow.
memory I have is that he had been in the hospital for a few days, and when he came home, he brought me a little, like, holiday elf that had been on his hospital door. But no one really talked about what had happened. My sister's recollection of it was that she was out that night and came home to find out that he'd been in the hospital. And
And the belief is that he took a bunch of aspirin. I'm not saying he was trying to overdose on anything, but he just took a lot of aspirin that got him very sick, that he had to
right.
go to the hospital.
And my mother, years later, talking to her about it, she had said it was around a time he had wanted to go on a ski trip, and they had told him that he couldn't go. So she had, felt that either he was so disappointed in that he took the aspirin. Um, I, my own thought is, anytime someone does something like that, it's a sign there's some emotional pain.
Mhm. And does you probably, I guess you maybe didn't know it at the time, but does that surprise you? Being that you knew your brother the way that you did, and did that surprise you? Do you think it surprised Sarah as well?
I think it surprised Sarah quite a bit. I think for me it was more, my recollection of it, that was more frightening because my memory is that seeing him, very sick, not knowing, what the context of it was back then.
Hmm.
Um, she was concerned. I'm sure she, probably had a better idea of what might have been going on, at least in terms of that was something, self-inflicted that caused him harm.
Yeah. And we have to keep in mind it was aspirin. It was not some drug that maybe if you
No,
overdose on it, it might kill you. Aspirin, I'm sure that would make you very sick. I don't know if you can overdose on aspirin, but it's certainly not like taking sleeping pills or something like that. Let's
right,
put it.
right, or
Let's.
even other types of, over-the-counter pain medications
Sure.
that can be, um, you know, pretty physically hard on a person.
Sure.
I do think that looking back, that they kept him in the hospital more because they knew that, probably psychologically there was something going on. Um, but I have no idea what he ever talked about it.
Okay. Another point I think we have to talk about, and we should stay for the record, that Bill's dad, your dad, is not a suspect in his disappearance at all. The only reason we're going to talk about this is because Bill was living home at the time.
Right.
And it might have been an instigation, might have been a situation where Bill might have said, "That's it, I'm out of here. I'm taking off. I'm leaving home. I'm leaving my life or whatever else." Can you talk a little bit about the relationship that Bill had with your dad?
They had a complicated relationship. At least they, I think, in terms of growing up, my memory, is that um, things were pretty peaceful. Um, have a lot of photographs of Bill and my father that would go to my paternal grandparents' home and go fishing, hunting. They lived in northern Minnesota. But as Bill got older and hit his teenage years, they argued a lot. They disagreed a lot. My sister's memory is we always ate dinner together every night as a family and of their arguing. And sometimes the arguing, was frightening. They would be pretty angry with each other. I have no recollection of what they argued about. They also, even up to a few months before Bill disappeared, had gone fishing together in November on Lake Superior, and so they had a bond, but they also had a hard father-son relationship too.
And it should be noted that you and your sister did not have that kind of relationship with your father, did you? You were a little bit more cordial.
I think my sense of it always was that because the difference that we were girls,
Uh,
and I remember talking to a friend of my brother's and asking him many years later if he was aware of their disagreements, and he said he always thought that my dad probably had really high expectations of Bill. But this was one of the friends that also went up with Bill and stayed with my dad up at Itasca. So um, they also had, um, times when they got along pretty well, probably, or at least shared interests. And I think my sister's thought is that that made sense. That as the oldest, the only male, the oldest male, he probably had a lot of expectations of how he should be and what he should do and what was right and wrong.
yeah, right, right. Okay. Another issue could be, and this is not something that you or your family, I think, found out for several years, but once again, it could be a factor in his disappearance. The listeners will have to judge that for themselves. But it seemed that Bill might have had, not that he ever spent any time in jail or anything like that, but he had a couple burglaries, it seems, under his belt at some point. When did you find that out? And how does that ring in your ear all these years later?
It was probably in the early 80s. I met with a friend of his that actually had been at the party when he left. And he said that Bill and some other guys kind of the same age used to burglarize cars, garages, my sister thought. Um, and that was a surprise, but maybe not a complete shock in some ways. Then in probably 2014, my sister and I met with the St. Paul Police and the BCA just to talk more about Bill and what we knew. And the St. Paul Police were able to find an arrest record for Bill on suspicion of burglary, but they weren't able to find anything about what the outcome of that. And that was 1968, and that did surprise us because we'd never heard that before.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that my mother had since died. I never had a sense that she was aware of that, but we don't know if if maybe our mother and father were aware of it or if it was something that they never knew about. And there was no record of what the outcome of it was, other than he had been arrested.
But to your knowledge, he never spent any days in jail. And at the time of his disappearance in early March 1969, were there any warrants out for his arrest or anything like that, to your knowledge?
No, nothing that we're aware of. And I think if there had been warrants, they probably would have had a record of that still. But they only had the arrest record, no outcome. And we followed up on it, and the police officer had looked into it, further to try to find something from back then, but wasn't able to. And they weren't able to. My parents had reported him as a missing person, and they weren't able to find a record of that, which he didn't think was probably that unusual that long ago.
Now that you look back at it, was there any conspicuous spending that Bill had done maybe that year before that might have caused you or your family to question how he was making his money? Did he have a job at the time while he was going to school, or was he just going to school? And what do you remember?
He'd always had a job when he was going to school at the university. I think he had a couple of different jobs. I never really probably paid that much attention to money or how he spent money. I know he had a savings account at the local bank, because that account, just slowly over time after he had disappeared, just sort of dwindled down with like a monthly fee. But
service charges
over many years.
Yeah.
The Christmas, and I'm not sure if it was the Christmas before he disappeared or beforehand, Christmas morning, there were unwrapped presents at everyone's place at the table, at the dining room table. And they were quite nice gifts. Mine was a watch with different colored bands. My sister remembered that it was a makeup mirror that had lights on it. I don't remember what my mother's gift was. My father's gift was quite an expensive down sleeping bag. And I don't know that I realized it at the time, but in talking to my sister over the years, a little bit, we both sort of wondered, like, where those gifts had come from, if they were things he'd bought, if they were stolen. We didn't know, and no sense of, but it was unusual, and it was certainly a memory that sort of stood out.
I'm sure it would, especially a college student who's, even today in 2017, their budgets are quite tight.
Right.
Even with a job. So,
right. And he didn't have a car. He didn't have, he didn't spend, money on gas, that sort of thing. So.
Okay. And we're going to cover one more point before we get into the day of his disappearance. But this is, I think, a topic we're going to get into a little bit later as well. But we're not even sure if it's the truth right at this point, and I want to preface it with that. But one of Bill's friends had said that Bill might have gotten into some scuffles. Would you like to tell the listeners about that? Once again, you've only ever heard this from one of his friends and not anybody else. So.
Right. And this was over the summer. My sister and I had an opportunity to meet with a good friend of Bill's through high school, who shared a lot of photographs, a lot of stories, had wonderful memories of Bill, but also had memories of knowing that something was troubling him, that there was something that he was dealing with. And he told us that after high school, they kind of went their separate ways because Bill had gotten into some things he couldn't condone. And my sister and I both thought, our first thought was that it would have something to do with drugs, because we knew that Bill used marijuana and that he drank. But what it was street fighting. And we were both, kind of repeated it, street fighting. And his recollection was that Bill had gotten involved with some guys from Minneapolis that were into street fighting. And I think, at the time we heard that, we were both kind of taken aback and didn't ask more about it. So um, we didn't know if it was like a fight club or if it was just fighting strangers on the street randomly, and still don't know. But in talking with you, Ed, about it, and um, asking, talking with my sister, we never noticed anything that would give us a thought that he'd been in a fight.
Right.
No recollections at all. And we
And
had talked.
And when did you find this out exactly? When did you first hear about this? What year was that?
July of 2017.
That recently, just like 6 months ago, is the first time since
Right.
Bill's disappearance in 1969 that you heard about that.
Right.
Wow.
Right.
Okay. And it's just from one person.
From one person. And we've never asked anyone else about it. And it could be that, Bill got, started hanging out with other people that were into that, or at least talked about it, but that he never actually did himself. So I don't know more about it than that.
Okay, and we're gonna
But that
come.
was
Please.
surprising.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure it was on top of everything. On top of everything else, you finding out about him doing some burglarizing back then that you probably didn't expect after almost 50 years to find out something about street fighting. But we're not even sure if it's true. And once again, we're going to approach that topic a little bit later. What can you tell the people about the day that he disappeared? And we should note for the record, we're not sure if it was March 1st or if it was March 2nd. It was either a Saturday or a Sunday. It might have even been the next weekend, March 8th or March 9th. We're still not sure about that, are we?
No. My sister probably has the best recollection of, um, people that have a better memory than I do of around that time. Her memory is that it was a Sunday when she saw him last, and that they had been studying for finals, and that at some point he went out in the evening, which wouldn't have been unusual, and then didn't come home for a few days, and then his friends started to call, and they didn't know where he was, and no one in our family knew where he was.
Now, this party that he went to, I mean, it's not allegedly, he was there. People did see him there.
Yes.
Do you know who held the party? Do you know, like all these years later, do you know the building that was in? What were the kinds of people at it? What can you tell the listeners? Anything that you can tell them about that particular party?
Well, not a lot, other than for a long time, we'd been the story about his leaving the party had always stayed the same. That it had been a party. My understanding is that there might have been other people there too, but it sounds like it was mostly friends from high school. It was during the Vietnam War.
Sure.
The party was held. In talking to people, some people could not remember where the party was, but it sounds like it was in Dinkytown, which is on the Minneapolis, right near the Minneapolis University of Minnesota campus, where there would have back then been a lot of apartments. No one has been able to remember who had the party, but that he was at this party. We've probably talked to 2 or 3 people that were also at the party, and they all have the same recollection that at some point Bill stood up and left, and no one saw him again. In talking more specifically to people who were there, we'd heard that one of the people at the party had just come back from Vietnam. It was during the draft, so people were concerned about that and worried about that. My sister's recollection is that Bill's physical for the draft would have been the following day, Monday. And
Because we hadn't talked about that, but he had gotten a draft notice.
Right.
Okay.
He'd gotten the draft notice. He had to go in for a physical. One of the people at the party had said that there was talk about Vietnam. There was also talk about suicide. And not in the context of anyone planning that, but more like what would people do if they did get drafted. And that I hadn't heard about until maybe 2 years ago. I also heard that people weren't, there was drinking at the party, but people weren't, just drunk. People were still, carrying on conversations. And that's really about all we know. But we've always heard that's always been the same story that people have heard.
And was this a party made up of Bill's friends from high school, or would you say that they were students at the University of Minnesota that were at this party?
Well, I know that some of his friends from high school were there. I don't know about who else was there. I've never gotten a sense it sounded like a really big party, more of a smaller. But it could have certainly been at someone's apartment that somebody else knew and they had gone to the party.
But still to this day, even though you have talked to some of the people at the party that night, nobody's quite sure who held it.
Right.
No, okay.
Never heard for sure who held it.
It could be
where exactly it was.
Could have been they just heard about the party through the grapevine and knew the address and kind of just showed up.
That could certainly have happened, especially back then, I think, or any time. But yes.
Okay. So he leaves. Somebody tries to follow him out the door. This person follows him out the door and can't find Bill. Bill is gone, and nobody is, allegedly, at least that we know of, seen him since. When did your family know that something wasn't quite right?
I think that from talking with, my sister, my mom, as she got older, would talk more about, have memories that she would share, was that it was, it could have been four days afterwards. Bill had a girlfriend. I didn't know the girlfriend. My sister knew he had a girlfriend, but had never met her. And he had friends that lived on campus, or it wasn't unusual that he might not be home for a few days. But after a few days, people were calling for him, and that's when, my parents realized nobody knows where he is. And they reported him as a missing person. I'm not sure exactly when. But it was probably at least, maybe two or 3 days.
Before the yellow flags, if not red flags, went up.
Right. That in talking with his friends that people had, nobody had seen him since this party. Also, my memory is that he had a coat, and he'd left his coat at the party, and someone returned the coat to my parents' house.
Okay. I wanted to ask you, you said that your sister and he were studying the evening before he went to that party. Were they studying at home? Were they on campus? Where were they before he went to the
home?
They were at home.
They were studying at home.
Okay.
And they both lived at home then, too.
Okay. So your sister didn't feel like going to the party, or did she even know about it back then? Do you know?
I think my sister and Bill probably socially were in different circles at that point. Okay. My sister sort of had her friends. I think Bill was probably, was maybe more into parties than my sister was.
Okay. So the police get the report. What did they do? Did they try to track down any of the people at the party? Did they find anything suspicious to your knowledge?
As far as I know, nothing really ever came of it. It's unfortunate at this point as kind of find more little things that I wish I had asked my mom or my dad. I think back then he was 21. He was an adult. There was nothing really pointing that there was, some sort of foul play. And it was a really different time, I think, in terms of missing people. I know my mom, and I have memories of her calling when any time a body was found in the Mississippi River, my mother calling the radio station. So I think that the news outlets probably was, if she was to get any information about him, it would have come from there, which is, sad to think about now. As far as I know, other than he was reported as a missing person, it never went further than that.
Speaking of the Mississippi River, the river does run through Minneapolis. Was it checked? Were any of the sections drugged? And how far is the river from where the party was held?
Well, the river wouldn't be far from Dinkytown at all, and nothing, that I don't think that anything was done specifically to look for Bill in the river. There were, over time there have been bodies found in the river, and then as time went on, and my sister and I, which was much later, through the BCA, they had no records of any body being found in the Mississippi River that had not been identified. That would have been his.
Yeah, and I'm thinking if it's early March in Minnesota with the snow melting, that probably the Mississippi would have been pretty high and fast at that time.
Right, and it could, there could have certainly been ice on it. He fished the Mississippi a lot. He also, he didn't have a car. He had a driver's license, but he didn't have a car, so he would have, how he would have gotten to that party. He probably either walked, which would be, would be a fairly long walk, but not undoable. And he did a lot of walking from home to the campus. And there was also a bus that went in between the campuses. So,
would he have had to have passed over the river to go from your house to the party, or would he come near the river? Just if he was just walking home?
No, he wouldn't have had to cross over the river. He would have probably crossed a section of town that had a lot of railroad tracks in it.
Okay.
But he wouldn't have had to cross the river to get home.
All right. So, and many of my listeners know, even to this day, that people being found in rivers is not unusual. That happens, and usually has to do with people maybe being drunk or on drugs or something, like stumbling around. And a lot of these are not suicides; they happen, quite a bit by accident, and that continues to this day in 2017. But what you're saying is that if Bill even came close to that river, he would have had to have gone in that direction. It would have been on his usual walk home.
Right. He would have been able to walk from that party home without ever crossing the river.
Okay. So, what did you think? I'm sure you were 13 when he disappeared, 13 or 14 when he disappeared.
I was 13. I thought, he would be coming home, and I think that we all thought that he had left, and that he had left because of the war and concerns about being drafted. I think a lot of his friends thought that at first. Over time, my being 13, he had my birthday is in March, and he had my birthday on his calendar, and I was sure he was going to be back in time for my birthday. And it was, we've never, for many years, his room stayed the same. Nothing was changed for many years. The thought really was that he would come back, that wherever he was, he would be back. And for me personally, it probably took into the late 1980s to realize that if he were if he were alive, he would have gotten in touch with my sister, because they were so close. So even if he didn't want to contact, our parents, he would have contacted her.
I was going to ask you about that. What was your sister Sarah saying at this time? She was the last family member to see him. She was uh, closer to him, probably than you were, just because of age. They're going to the same school. Was her opinion the same, that he had maybe gone to Canada or something to avoid the draft? That was her opinion as well.
I think that she thought, that, or that maybe he'd gotten in, I think the other thought was, had he gotten involved in drugs in some way. Um, there was just so little to kind of go on. Some of the concerns were that he didn't have a coat, and it was, at the most maybe that time of year. And I think I've checked to see what the temperature was around that time in 1969. Might have been in the 30s during the day, and colder at night. He didn't have his wallet with him, and he never cashed his last paycheck, and he never touched his savings account. So if he had left, it doesn't sound like something he would have either had to given it a lot of thought or no thought. And I think as time went on, more so, I know my mother always hoped that he would come home, and used to, I think, be kind of angry that he wasn't coming home. I think it was hard for her to consider that he had died.
And so it was tough to cope. You have your
Very.
sister, and then you have your parents. And
Right.
even
And
if your father did have a little bit of a contentious relationship with Bill, I'm sure it was tough for him as well.
right. I think it was very hard, and my memory is that I certainly knew he was gone, but I don't have memories. My sister doesn't have memories of that. We really talked about it. It felt like a big silence that sort of fell over us all. Um, I can remember, um, going to school, and my sister and brother had gone to the same school, and going into a class, and the teacher recognizing my name and asking how Bill was. And this was maybe 6, 7 months after he had disappeared. And I said, I don't know. And the teacher was, I don't know what he thought I was saying, but was just, how can you not know how he is? And I had to tell him that we didn't know where he was. And I think that just saying that at that point, and to other people, is hard, and it's hard for people to know what to say. I think my parents reached out to people that he knew from time to time to try to, find out if anybody had heard from him. I suspect as I've gotten older, I think they did more of that than I realized at the time. I think they were probably, I can only imagine what it must be like to be a parent and have a child disappear.
Right. Being that your teacher didn't know that Bill disappeared, should that lead myself and the listeners to believe that it wasn't what you would call a big story? Was it not in the paper? What do
Oh,
you
I'm
think
sure
about
there was
that?
nothing.
What do you think
Yeah,
about
I'm
that?
sure there was nothing in the paper. I'm sure there was, I can't imagine that there was anything. And that was, at the time that didn't strike us. That would be it's so different now.
Yeah.
But then, no, somebody left, and they would be reported. I'm sure if he had been a minor, it would have been different. But he was an adult, and I think just the kind of the state of the country at that time, it wasn't unusual that people that someone might up and leave, or that they might, that he might have gone to Canada, given the context of things. It was shocking for us as a family, but I think from the outside, in terms of what law enforcement or, that would have done, that wasn't unusual.
Do you maybe remember this? Did any of Bill's other friends maybe try to avoid the draft? Do you think any of them maybe went to Canada, maybe came back, once eventually they were pardoned in the 1970s? But do you think Bill ever knew of anybody that did that and thought he might copy what they did? Do you remember any of that?
I don't know anybody that of his friends that did, but it's possible. I know that I'm sure it wasn't unusual in at a party with people of that age. Vietnam was on the television, and how many soldiers died, was on the news every day, every night.
Yep.
At dinner.
Yep.
So I don't know. I know my father, I think, tried to find out what he could about that possibility. Don't think he ever found anything, any answers to it. I think everyone just, and as my sister had said, kind of just tried to carry on with the hope that he would come back.
And we should tell the listeners the draft number that he got. What were the odds of him actually being drafted? I mean, I know he was going to go in for this physical, but what were the odds that he would actually get drafted?
My sister's memory is that after he disappeared, his number actually turned out to be quite high. So the odds were in his favor that he would not have been drafted. But I don't believe that he knew that. I'm sure he didn't know that at that time. My mom, I believe, contacted the draft board to try to find out, what she could, and she received some notice that said he wouldn't be drafted. But I don't know if that was connected to the physical or just that he had a higher number. In fact, I'm not sure that he ever made it for the physical. If he was gone the night before and never, which is what I think happened. I think her concern was he supposed to show up, and that he hadn't showed up for it.
To your knowledge, did he get in trouble for not showing up for this physical or anything like that? Was he in once? Did he get in trouble? Would that be a felony? I'm not sure how that all works now, but
I don't think anything that we ever heard of, and I do think that my mom had gotten something saying that, either due his number being so high, something, but or she let them know that he was missing. That I'm not aware of anything ever coming of that.
I guess what I'm saying is that if he did run away and then he didn't show up for his physical, it's not like that automatically would get him in trouble. He wouldn't be thrown in the brig or anything like that. He could have reappeared at some point down the road without having to worry about being a felony or anything like that.
Right, I would think so.
Okay.
And I can remember, at times he would talk about joining the Army, and other times when I think that would have been the last thing he would have wanted to do. So I think he probably felt torn between, should he go on his own, or should he wait and see what the odds were that he would be drafted? Must have been a difficult time.
Sure. Now, you were 13 at the time, so right into your teen years, became a young woman, and you've done some things, though, over the years. I don't know when this exactly started, but to try to find out what might have happened to him. And one of the things that you did was you actually went to one of Bill's high school reunions. Why don't you tell the listeners how that all came about and what'd you do there?
The first time was his class, the class of 1966, had a birthday party because uh, all of the class would have been turning 66 that year. And so that was probably 2014. And Bill's class knew that he, was missing. And one of the women that was organizing this gathering had contacted my sister Sarah, and we met with her and sort of shared what we knew over the years, and she invited us to go to this celebration, and I went, and it was awkward. They had a table of in memoriam for their classmates that had died, and then they had a picture of Bill, and that has been missing this whole time. And although it was awkward at first, and probably, I would guess, probably a little bit uncomfortable for other people there, people did approach me and shared stories that I had never heard, wonderful stories about Bill. Friends of his that cried, not ever knowing what happened to him. And sort of realizing the impact that had had on other people, as well as, our family, that, he had friends and people that also loved him that never got to say goodbye to him. So it was very helpful in terms of sort of hearing new stories, but, also that nobody had heard anything different other than that he'd left this party. I met a girl that he dated in high school, which had no idea about. And most of the stories were good ones, although it was a sad, situation too, that no one had ever heard back from him. But it gave us contacts with people that were helpful. And then 2 years later, then my sister and I went to his 50th reunion and had the chance again to talk with some of his classmates. And Sarah would have just been a year younger, so she knew more of these people than I did. They remembered her from high school. Sure. And it was helpful.
Were any of those people at the party that night? Any of these people they were at that party that he disappeared?
One of the girl that he had dated in high school was at the party. She and Bill weren't dating then, but they had stayed friends. She had been there. She actually was able to. I talked with her a couple of times after the party, and she tried to find out where the party was. She couldn't remember, and she was able to talk to somebody, though, that had been there, one of his classmates, that had been the person that had followed him out the door, because they were concerned about him, and he couldn't find him. So I've talked to at least 2 people directly that were at the party with him.
And so we should be clear that this girl was not his girlfriend at the time. This was an ex-girlfriend who was at this party where Bill was. Did she remember talking to him that night? I mean, were they on good terms by that time, or?
Sounds like they were on good terms. She didn't, nothing in particular stood out for her. She was the person who shared, after talking to someone else had been there, and I think maybe it helped her, memory some, that there was a lot of talk about the war, and there was talk of suicide. And I think she was reluctant to tell me that.
So she was shocked as everybody else that he disappeared, just completely.
Right. I think, in talking with his friends, I think they knew that Bill probably didn't feel very good about himself, or was maybe feeling sort of lost, and that they tried to kind of buoy him up. But I don't think that anybody saw that he would just disappear coming.
So why do you think they said that? That to kind of pep them up a little bit. Was it about the draft, or was it about something else? Just his
I
overall
think it was.
demeanor. What do you think that meant?
I think it was about, maybe the draft, just about life, what direction he was going. I think they saw him as. My sense was, and I don't know that anybody used this word, but that maybe he was depressed, um, and just didn't feel very good about himself.
Okay. I wonder why that would be. No, seemed to be doing okay. Had a job, going to school. But we know that people get can be down for all sorts of reasons. Even things are going well.
Right,
Sometimes
right.
that's the way it works. Of course.
And there's been, not in my immediate family, but in extended family, there's been depression and suicide in the family. And he could have, it could have been, something that was not connected to events as much as to, just his chemistry.
Would he have known about that in 1969? Would he have been aware that some of his older family members had committed suicide?
No, our grandmother, our um, paternal grandmother, had died a couple of months before Bill disappeared. Um, but I didn't know, and my mother didn't know. My sister didn't know that she had died um, from suicide. But as far as I know, Bill did not know that.
Okay. Now, we already mentioned an ex-girlfriend. Now, I think this is probably uh, a very surprising part of this conversation. It was for me, and I think it was for you when it happened. And we're only going to use her first name. Her name is Terry. What can you tell the listeners about her?
Well, about 2 years ago, a neighbor helped me start a Facebook page for Bill as a missing person. And when we were putting in his name, the Charlie Project came up, and there had been mention of Bill, and two people had commented. And one of the people had said, "I remember Bill from the University of Minnesota, and we used to talk in the library," and it was Terry. And I didn't know if Terry was a man or a woman at the time. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And then also another person had commented that turned out to be someone that knew Bill very well from up at Itasca. And then through the Facebook page, Terry, and I'm not sure exactly even how it happened, Ed, but Terry was a woman, and Terry was a woman that had dated Bill up until the time he disappeared. And that was just a incredible. I don't even know how to explain it after so long. To
Just to be clear, that he
yes,
disappeared in 1969, and you didn't know about Terry. I'm guessing your sister Sarah didn't know about Terry. I'm guessing your
no.
parents didn't know about Terry.
Well, we actually were able to meet Terry
Yeah.
2 summers ago.
Okay.
We met with her, and she told us that our mother had called her. So somehow our mom had known about Terry, although Terry had never met her. Bill either told our mom about Terry, but our mom was enough of a detective that she found her and asked her if she'd seen Bill and when she'd seen Bill last. So it was just a wonderful to meet her and talk to her.
It
And
must have been like a little bit like a time capsule, because she's
oh, it
going to
was. It was
remember him exactly as he was from 1969.
right. Yeah, it was just incredible. Um, and she was she's a beautiful person, and was very gracious talking with us. And she brought a picture that Bill had given her of Lake Superior, And I think it was a picture that was taken when he and our dad had gone up to Lake Superior in November 1968. And she brought a fishing lure that he'd given her. And they had met in the fall of 1968 and were introduced by mutual friends. And she just had adored him. And their time spent together was, studying. They did a lot of walking. And she, she was just devastated when she realized he was gone, and has always, kind of looked for him. And with technology, we've kind of found each other, which was just amazing.
But here's probably the biggest part about meeting her is that you didn't find out until you encountered her, I guess, a couple years ago. Once again, we're talking about a disappearance in 1969. You didn't find out until 2015 that Bill might have left that party that night, but we have a pretty good idea that he called her that
Right,
night. And I mean, that had to be a mind blower.
right.
And what did Terry say about that?
She said that Bill had, and of course she didn't know that that was the last night she was ever going to see him, but he had called. She believes it was between maybe 9 and 11. He had called her, and she was worried about him. She said he sounded very sad. He told her he was going away and told her to take care of herself. She was worried about him and asked him where he was. He wouldn't tell her. She, her guess was that he was calling from a phone booth. He wouldn't tell her where he was or where he was going. Her hope was that he was going somewhere and he'd be back, but she also had a bad feeling about it. And I think that it might have actually been when our mother called her that she realized that nobody knew where he was.
Can't imagine that. Just can't imagine being in her shoes, getting a call from this guy that she's dating. That I'm guessing. I don't know if I'm guessing she loved him, but 6 months in, hard to know.
Right, right,
But she deeply cared about him one way or the other, and he's telling her this. I mean, that had to have been devastating for her. And then on top of that, him actually following through and not reappearing again.
right. And it was, another instance of feeling someone else's loss, of this shared loss of this person that had known, Bill in a much different way than I had, and that she just deeply cared for him, and I think it's always haunted her too, and other people that knew him, as to what happened, and to never have any, any answer.
When
Is
she got that call, did
hard.
she think that he was going, let's just put it this way, did she think that he was going to commit suicide? Or did that ever cross her mind? Did she say anything about that?
She said, I don't think she used those words, but she said, that she had a bad feeling and that she was concerned he was going towards water, is what she said. That either he would go up to Lake Superior, which would have been a long, long stretch of hitchhiking, but possible. But she had a bad feeling, but I think wanted to hope that that wasn't the case. We asked her if Bill had ever talked about, his relationship with our dad. He never had. He never talked to her about it. I don't think he talked to many people. I mean, there might have been some people, but not people that we've talked to directly. Other than I think they knew that it wasn't always the easiest. She'd never heard anything. She'd been to our parents' house one time, but hadn't met our parents. But Bill must have told her mom about her, and my mother was able to to contact her, either find a phone number or something. So that was kind of an interesting little fact about our mom too, that she had, you know, had done that, um, and it was, I guess all I can say was just so wonderful to have met Terry, and we stay in touch by Facebook and hope
Yeah.
to, meet up again. She's been very generous.
Sure. Yes. When was the last time she actually saw him in person before he disappeared? Do you know?
Well, she said it. She was maybe 3 days before she got the phone call, and that he had stopped by her apartment, and that's when he gave her the picture of Lake Superior and the lure, and that was the last time she saw him.
And I'm sure I of course asked you this question originally, and I'm sure some of the listeners are thinking about it as well. If they were boyfriend and girlfriend, is there a reason that they didn't go to this party together that night?
I I um I don't know. I mean, I'm sure they went to parties together. My thought in kind of thinking about the timeline, if it was finals and she had finals, she might have been studying too, and Bill might have just gone to this party, not, um, with much forethought of it. So that doesn't strike me as that unusual that he might go to a party, especially if it were high school friends. That he might have
Yeah.
gone by himself.
Okay. Because I have to admit that it goes through my mind. Maybe he didn't bring Terry with him because he knew an ex-girlfriend was going to be at this party as well. I mean, could that maybe been something? It's just, I've not been a big relationship guy in my life, frankly, but I know that boyfriends and girlfriends usually go to parties together, so that's why I felt I had to ask that.
Right. And we had, for a long time, what we'd heard is that Bill had just broken up with a girlfriend um, before his disappearance. And so we, asked Terry, had you hadn't broken up with him or um, anything? And she said no. So I don't know if he had another girlfriend, but I didn't get that sense. And it's also possible that he called and said goodbye to her, and you know, I don't know how people. I've never heard what girl he had broken up with. Nobody seemed to know who the girlfriend was that he had supposedly broken up with. But it wasn't her. So
Okay.
that's sort of an unfinished mystery in a way of if it's people's memories or what.
Now, we should be clear on something, though. Being that we don't know exactly the date that Bill disappeared, your sister thinks it was a Sunday, but you look at NamUs and other places, it's going to say March 1st, which anybody can check that out. It was a Saturday.
Right.
We can't be 100% sure that the phone call he made to her and the night that he disappeared are actually the same night. It would make sense. It would certainly make sense, and it's perfectly logical. Well, we don't have any data to support that. We just
Right.
have we just
Right.
have our gut feeling that that's the same night.
You're right. And it could have been that he would have, if he had talked to her, um, had called her the night before, and then um, maybe he would have told someone he'd broken up with a girlfriend. But
Right.
um, it might have meant something different than what most of us would think of as breaking up with somebody.
Sure. Now we touched upon. I told the listeners we were going to come back to these couple topics. You had a chance to talk to Terry about this rumor that Bill might have doing some street fighting. Anything that Terry ever experienced with Bill that was the case? Ever seen any bruises on him or anything like that? Ever?
No, she said that was very surprising to her. She had never, there was no indication of anything like that. And in fact, she said that all she knew of him was gentleness and kindness.
He was very good with her, very respectful, good boyfriend. That's how she
Right,
remembers
right.
him. Okay. So no bruises or anything never came up in any conversations in those 6 months that they dated. Did
No,
she, I don't know if you've asked her this, but if she listened to this program, she's going to know. Did she know anything about his burglary history that we talked about earlier?
no, no. And I think we had, I think Sarah and I had talked with her about that, or, we kind of shared what we have heard over the years, and she shared, what she knew at the time. Um, so no,
Hmm.
and I don't know if that was something. I think the fellow that I talked to originally that had brought it up, my sense was that was something that they had done in high school, but
Hmm.
1968 would have been a couple years
After.
after when he was arrested. So um, I don't know if he was with anybody else, um,
Hmm.
or where they found him.
Sure. Just wanted to ask you that. Just seems that those things never came up. And in fact, you already
No,
stated that he never mentioned to her anything about the issues that he had with your father either. That wasn't something
no,
that Terry knew about either. Okay.
no, because we were, curious to know. It, did he talk to people about that? Was it, was our perception of that different than maybe what his was, um, or what impact that might have had on him? Um, I don't know.
Did Terry ever give you any reason why it took all these years for you to meet each other? I mean, almost 50 years. Did she ever think about trying to look for you? Of course, you didn't know she existed, but she surely knew that Bill had two younger sisters, Sarah and
Well,
you. And did it
yeah.
come
I
up?
mean, I actually, I don't know that we asked her that.
Okay.
He, it might have been something they talked about. It might not have. Um, I think, probably for her, having talked to our mother back then, um, and then I think, her life after a period of time went on. Um, so I don't. I mean, it is quite amazing that after all that time, because that was um, a big a big piece of, for me, of kind of knowing him a little bit better. The other person on the Charlie Project that had commented, who was a friend of Bill's from up in Itasca, whose family was from Arizona, has just added tremendously to his Facebook page, shared so many wonderful stories of Bill and photographs, wonderful photographs,
I've seen them,
um,
yeah.
and that he and Terry were the people that had commented together on the Charlie Project page. So um, it's it's kind of amazing, to say
Yeah.
the least.
It was kind of, I wouldn't necessarily, of course, you haven't forgotten, your family hasn't forgotten, but maybe to the public and maybe some of those friends and everything, they've moved on, but then all of a sudden it's all alive again. In
Right,
2015, of course, you did some things at class reunion, but then you run into this woman for that disappearance. It's still like it's yesterday. She
right.
remembers this guy that disappeared, and you should know that she must be a very special person, because I can tell you, in covering as many disappearances that I've covered, you find that a lot of boyfriends and girlfriends, even if they're not even suspects in a disappearance, they tend to move on fairly quickly. And it's amazing how when you try to get in touch with them many years later, they don't want to talk. I can't tell you how
Right.
much that happens. I can't say anything on the record. I'm just telling you that is certainly the case. So it's good that Terry isn't like that.
No, she was. I think we were. She was very helpful to us, and I think that it was helpful for her to have, um, to be able to talk with Sarah and I about it. And it was just, more than I had at this point, so many years later, had really hoped for. And like you said, that someone remembers him with so much love,
Yep.
and has
He'll
always
always
wondered what happened to him.
he'll always be 20 years old in her mind.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh Now that of course you're a grown woman, and now, why is it that you don't think that you knew about Terry? Was it something that she seems like a fine woman all these years later that you didn't know about him? Obviously, your sister didn't know about him. She was going to school with Bill. Do you have a chance to think about that a little bit?
I think
Any?
our family was. Of course, I was younger, but I don't remember meeting any of Bill's girlfriends, any of my sister's boyfriends. Um, I think I remember my sister going to prom and maybe someone picking her up, but besides that, um, that just wasn't. I think our family was a small family for sure, and that my brother and sister they sort of had lives outside of the family that certainly I didn't know about, and then I don't know that my mom and dad did, other than maybe that if they were dating someone, and they knew Bill's um, male friends, and
Yeah,
had been to the house and things like that, and up to Itasca, but we weren't a family where like our friends came to dinner kind of thing. So that doesn't that part didn't surprise me. Um, and another type of family, it might be a big surprise.
sure. Just depends on the family. You're right. You're
Right.
right. You're right. You're right. Do you have plans on meeting Terry maybe again in person sometime, 2018 or sometime? Any plan?
Right. I had, my sister and I would, hope to meet her again maybe next summer and talk with her more. I know she follows his Facebook page. Um, and, you know, the Facebook page has, um, brought a lot in terms of um, his friend Tom that has, posted a lot and shared a lot. And then just other, of his friends that sometimes will make a comment, or someone will, just post something saying that they remember him from high school and that he was always, really what we've heard is that he was very, very kind. I think he was a bit adventurous. Someone could remember that he'd climbed outside of a fire tower one time. He'd been a lifeguard. He was probably um, a daredevil in some ways, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and and this is not coming up in our conversation, but I think I'd read something about did he have polio as a child, Bill?
He had polio as a child. And I'm guessing, I don't remember it, so I'm guessing it was probably before I was 5. So I'm thinking he was maybe like, oh, I don't know, 7 or 8. He was maybe younger. And I can remember my mother telling me that back then they could not visit him. And that was really hard on him, that they could not come and visit him. But they wouldn't even allow parents, from what it sounded like, that they could not go and visit him.
But he
And I don't
fully
know how
recovered from
long
that. I mean, polio, of course, at one point was a lethal disease, but he fully recovered from that?
he did. He did.
Wow. That's spectacular. Wow. Yeah, because that listeners should know that that was just something I read recently that did not come up in our prior conversations. It's
Right.
really
I,
amazing that he can recover from that.
yeah, I think it was. I think it's on the NAMA site, because I think they'd asked
Maybe.
if there were
Yeah.
any, and we knew he'd had polio, and when he was wrestling, he dislocated his shoulder one time. But other than that, there weren't, any marks or things that would stand out.
Mhm. How did your family cope with this disappearance? Like you said a little bit earlier, you don't know how parents do it. How did your parents do it, and how did you move on? How did you and your sister move on with your lives?
I think looking back. We all dealt with it in our own way. I think it was, and a lot of that was to not talk about things. It was really only as my parents were older that we did talk about it. That they, I think, really that they could talk about it. I'm sure that they had, you know, um, regrets. Wish they had, I think that's the sort of situation that always, hindsight is so much better of what you wish you might have asked or could have done or would have said. I know that my mom, um, probably just a few months, not even a few months, 2 months maybe before she died, was when the BCA took her DNA and my sister's DNA. They had my DNA because there was a skeleton found probably in 2005 that the BCA had done a skull of and had on the news, and one of my brother's friends had thought it looked like Bill, and so had contacted my mother, and then I contacted the sheriff's department where the bones had been found, and the BCA took my DNA at that time, didn't match those bones, but just from 2005 to 2013, um, you know, things had improved even more, and they took my mother's DNA and my sister's DNA, and that's when his profile was put on NamUs
Okay.
as a missing person.
Mm-hmm.
So she had hopes until the day she died that she would find out something about him.
Yeah. Yep, we've talked about that on Unfound before. Parents passing away before a son or daughter, is found. It's
Right.
can't imagine
I
it.
had a good friend whose brother was a friend of Bill's who visited my mother just a day or two before she died, and um, Bill came up, and um, my friend had told her that his friends always thought that Bill had just gone to the Caribbean and had met some beautiful woman and was living his life, and it was kind of a sweet story, but I think it offered her some comfort to know that people had not forgotten about him. Um,
Yeah.
and I think she felt that I'm sure there were many things that she wished she'd been able to say to him. And, my friend just offered her, just said to her, you know, he, he, if he had been back, it would have been different. He didn't get a chance to make things right,
Yeah.
which was a kindness that he offered. Because I think it's hard for people to know what to say, um, and so sometimes people just don't say anything.
Yeah, it's can be difficult. If people don't have any experience with a disappearance or something like that, yeah, it's hard to find the right words.
Yes, it is.
It's hard. I, as you know, and as listeners know, I've been doing this for over a year, and I know a lot of people like yourself. But I also know a lot of people who have never experienced what you have as well. And I think that among those people who've never experienced it, uh, it's tough to find the right words. And I know that me, even having done this for a year, it's hard for me to find the right words.
Right.
And you're so afraid of saying the wrong thing that you just don't say anything at all.
Right, right. And
You
I've
know,
certainly done that myself. And I'm always, surprised at how many, missing people there are. I know
uh,
growing up, it seemed, I had no idea of how many people are
yeah,
missing in our
yes,
country.
thousands and thousands,
Yes.
thousands, thousands.
And, for um, children, younger children, it's just, you know, I can only imagine how incredibly difficult that must be.
Yep. Yep. Why don't you give the listeners all those places that they can find information about Bill? I know there's this website that you were talking about that has all those great pictures. I know I've been to the website. Why don't you give the listeners that website first?
Well, it's on Facebook, and it's William Campbell Underhill Missing Person. So I think it's pretty easy to find. And there are many wonderful pictures of Bill and stories that people have shared. I think he's on NamUs and the Charlie Project.
Sure.
And I'm always surprised that I think sometimes he's on other sites that I'm unaware of, which is also kind of one of the wonderful things about technology.
It is.
Although I often, say that I'm not up to date at all technologically, it certainly, offered us a great deal of help and solace in knowing that people remember him, and every little piece just sort of helps fit things together. I don't know that we'll ever find him, but I certainly still hold out hope that maybe we would find his bones and be able to bury them and be able to do that for him in some way.
Yes. There's probably a lot of bad things about social media and the internet, and we know all of the stuff that goes on out there, but without it,
right.
You never meet Terry.
We'd never meet Terry. We never would have found Tom, the fellow from Arizona.
Yeah.
Right. Wouldn't be doing this right now.
Yeah.
I'm very grateful for this too, Ed.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. Any last words before we conclude this interview, Mary?
No, just thank you very much. Appreciate your efforts and your work and the people that listen and that, kind of keep looking.
That's what my listeners do. They take a deep interest in all the cases we covered. I can tell you that some of my listeners have gotten quite a bit into quite a few of the cases that we've covered, meeting some of the guests and helping them, and I'm hoping some of them can help you as well.
Thank you so much.
And I appreciate you being on this episode of Unfound.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And that was my interview with Mary Underhill, sister of Bill Underhill. I thank her for being on the program. As I was putting this episode together, I couldn't help but think of me being 20 years old in 1990, and how much different it was from when Bill was that age. Yes, when I was that age, we had the first Gulf War, but it was nothing like Vietnam, of course. No chance of being drafted, no beliefs of communism taking over the world, and it didn't end up being much of a contest between Iraq and the United States and its allies. My life and pretty much any other 20-year-olds were pretty much carefree compared to Bill's in 1969. But that's the way it was. So, what happened to Bill? On the one hand, I'm hopeful. He had reasons to want to leave. Whether it was fear of being drafted or the arguments with his father, I've even entertained the fact that Bill felt he was getting a little too serious with his girlfriend and was feeling painted into a corner. So he needed to bust out and couldn't find a way to end it. He wouldn't be the first guy to suddenly vanish out of a relationship. I think that's called submarining these days. Whatever the case, if he's out there, I hope he comes home soon. On the other hand, although the call to his girlfriend certainly adds more info to the disappearance if it happened the night that Bill went missing, it feels a bit dire. It feels to me like a nice guy doing what nice guys do, not leave people hanging. He couldn't just leave. He needed to do it with an explanation, and despite his words, it feels very final, although it isn't quite as clear as a suicide note. And I also can't help but wonder if Bill thought the police might be coming after him for his burglaries the preceding year. Remember, he got fingerprinted by the FBI. I bring this up because I can't believe they just let Bill go off scot-free if in fact they thought he was guilty. And maybe this combined with a couple beers in his system made him do something he normally wouldn't do. Furthermore, Did Bill get in trouble with the fighting he may or may not have been a part of? We may never know. We can't even be sure it happened. I'll be interested to hear your opinions on all this in the comments section at the Unfound Podcast discussion group. With that, I'll leave the rest of the theorizing up to you. And that's the program. If you found it informative, please go to the app that you use to listen to Unfound and give this podcast a 5-star review. I thank you for listening. I'm Ed Densel, and you've been listening to Unfound.